Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Asian Hustle Network podcast. Today, we have a very special guest with us. His name is Sahil Lavingia, and we are so excited to have him today. Sahil is the founder and CEO of Gumroad and the author of The Minimalist Entrepreneur. Sahil, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
I like that intro a lot. It appeals to, if you guys are just listening to the podcast and can't see the sign behind, it says the minimalist entrepreneur. And I like that intro a lot. It appeals to everything. But we're gonna take a huge step back. Like, tell us about your upbringing, your childhood, and how that shaped you to become the person that you are today.
Yeah, totally. So I was born in New York to two parents who immigrated from India and kind of pursued the American dream as one does, and but mostly grew up in Singapore. So my parents left the United States, moved to Singapore, and I was kind of primarily grew up in Singapore, and that's kind of where I started getting into kind of like technology at a pretty early age. I learned about Photoshop. That was kind of my first kind of like the gateway drug into sort of online content creation, where I was pretty blown away that this piece of software could like basically make things up, like images that didn't exist in reality. Like it was crazy to me. And so I started getting into all these like online tutorials and just like started making stuff for myself. And pretty quickly, I don't know, word gets around, like people would need websites and, it's like, hey, Sahil knows how to design websites in Photoshop. Like you should talk to him. And so I started doing like freelance, making basically just enough money to buy Xbox games. That was kind of like the currency of my childhood. And very quickly like ran out of Xbox games to buy. It turns out there's not that many games that I really wanted to play. But kept doing that. And then, once I did that, like I think this is a theme that I often see is that once you start doing freelance, you start having your own ideas. Like it's kind of almost inevitable that you build stuff for other people, you design stuff for other people, and you can't help but think like, once you do that for enough different people, you kind of triangulate on your own ideas. You're like, oh, I could build this or design this. And so that's kind of what I started doing. And the timing was perfect because as I started getting into that, the iPhone came out. And so that created a very clear to me sort of new area of opportunity, kind of like almost like a sort of technological gold rush in a sense, where there was this new piece of land that no one had yet really built upon. And so I started making iPhone apps, just again, kind of solve my own problems. I built like a taxi cab calling app before Uber in Singapore and built a bunch of other things. And that was kind of my foray into sort of startups. Once you start getting into that, you start reading TechCrunch and Mashable and all of those kind of blogs at the time. Started using Twitter back in 2008. Knew that I needed to eventually, like I was still in Singapore, like I would basically wake up, Silicon Valley was asleep. I'd kind of catch up on what everyone was up to, like the Apple keynote or whatever had happened. But I felt very disconnected to kind of like my people in a sense. Like there was very few people around me that knew what Y Combinator, what Hacker News, what, TechCrunch, venture capital, right? Any of these terms, what they meant. And so I knew I had to be in California. And so I moved to the States to go to college at USC for a semester. Ended up also realizing there that there were not enough people around me that knew what startups and venture capital and all of these things were. And so I had to move to the Bay Area, and my ticket to moving to the Bay Area was getting my first job at Pinterest. So Ben, the CEO of the company, had seen my work online, a bunch of these apps that I had made. I assume he probably checked out my Twitter account, saw that I was, not stupid at least, and just sent me an email out of the blue saying, hey, I work at this company called Pinterest. Like we're looking for we have this app, this web app. We need a mobile app. We need an iPhone app. Can you help us? And I was like, yeah, happy to help. And so I sort of built a prototype, and that kind of led to the job. And I sort of dropped out of USC in fall of 2010, I guess it would have been, and joined Pinterest full time. And then I was there until I started Gumroad. So that was kind of my upbringing in a nutshell.
We have a lot to unpack right there. There's so much that happened, right? We take it back a step. It's like, wow, your sense of motivation as a kid, as a young person, it's tremendous, right? And when we talk a little more about that, like, have your parents sort of installed a sense of discipline inside you, or was it something where it was like you realized what you wanted in life at a young age, right? And let's dive deeper into that too. How did you realize that, and how did your parents support you along the way? Because I would imagine, like, if I would have told my parents, like, hey, I'm dropping you off for this unknown startup, they'll look at me like, get your butt back in school. What are you doing? You know? So I just want to hear more about that side of the story.
Yeah, my parents were a little bit more encouraging than you'd expect. I mean, the entrepreneurship kind of, you know, or even before entrepreneurship, because even when I went to USC, my plan was very much to graduate, get a job at Google, kind of work my way down smaller and smaller companies until eventually, like 10, 15 years from then, I would have my own company. Like that's how I saw my career kind of developing over time, right? Because that was kind of the path that I you know, other people had generally taken. And so it really started with software engineering. And I think software engineering is kind of a great place, kind of a great gateway drug into entrepreneurship, because it is, to me, like a very kind of independent, sort of free, anyone can create a Stripe account now or an iTunes account and start selling products directly to an audience without a degree, without a certification. Like you can't start practicing law or become a doctor as a 16-year-old kid, like not super cool, right? But you can totally start becoming a software engineer. And so that's initially what attracted me to that, is just the lack of gatekeepers. Like I've always had a problem with people who say I can or cannot do something. And so it was kind of like, I thought about going into architecture, like similar problems. And so software engineering was really the only path that I saw to being able to like make stuff without gatekeepers telling me that I could or could not make stuff, right? But I didn't at that time consider it like a real job. I was like, oh, I can make like a couple $1,000 a month, like on the side, and it'll be cool, right? I didn't really realize like, wow, you can actually make a career out of this, and it's called software entrepreneurship or startups or whatever. But the reason I got into it was partially because I saw, you know, my parents emigrated from the US to go to Singapore to kind of try to grow their careers and find more success. And so there was kind of a lot of my peer group, or, you know, similar kind of parents. And everyone, like literally, I never met a parent who loved what they did. Like everyone I met, like and totally fair, because, you know, you're optimizing for different things when you're an immigrant, you're leaving India, like very different kind of set of motivations, right? But there was like a singular focus on basically, we need to get rich. We need to make money so that our kids can go to college, or whatever the kind of motivations may be. They never wanted that to be kind of a bottleneck to me or my brother. But everyone I talked to, like whose parents were in finance or whatever else, like no one was excited about what they did every day. Like I still can't really tell you like what my parents, like what my dad did, you know, for work, like at his job, like moving numbers around or whatever. Like it just felt like soulless to me. And so I knew that while everyone else I knew basically was going to get into some sort of corporate track, either in finance or, you know, iBanking, or I don't know, consulting, or, which is actually like now when I talk to my high school friends, like almost everyone actually did that, you know. I was the only one who did not who pursued software engineering and entrepreneurship and startups and all these sorts of things, which honestly blew my mind, given how obvious it felt the iPhone was to me. And even today, I still feel like there's a lack of people getting into it, to be honest. But yeah, that was a huge motivational thing for me, where I was like, wow, everyone I talk to hates what they do. So there's no way I can ever get into the finance industry. Like it just seems brutal. No one likes what they do. You don't get to make anything. Yeah, I just didn't, you know. And so that was really my motivation, was like, what can I do so that I don't have to do that, right? What is an alternative? What is an exit strategy? And that was kind of software and startups. And when I realized like, wow, I can put an app in the App Store, charge $199, $299 for it, and like a few hundred people will pay me money for that, maybe more. That was kind of the gateway drug for me. Like, wow, like once this is, you know, it's kind of Pandora's box, right? Like once you realize that is possible, then the world kind of opens up quite a bit, I think. So that's kind of, I think, why I got into it initially. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just to frame things for our listeners in perspective, 2010 was a pretty turbulent time because it was right after the '08 housing crash. For you to be comfortable with even more instability during that time period, shout out to your personality and your risk averse abilities to like see the opportunity and go for it. And on top of that, in 2010, software engineering isn't as popular as it is today, right? I mean, I'm also a fellow software engineer too. I graduated 2010, so I see the market at the time. If I were compete with these kids nowadays, I would lose so hard. You know,
I'm very glad that I'm not starting off today. That's for sure.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
also want to add to that too. It's like, I also know a lot of people in like finance and accounting. That stuff is like very robotic work, like Sahil, you're right. Like you're not really creating anything. You're just going into work and like doing the same thing over and over again. And Brian and I actually talk about this all the time in terms of like schools teaching about software engineering and computer science in like San Francisco school district. I actually grew up in San Francisco and I went to school in San Francisco, and they actually rarely taught any classes on that subject. And that's so ironic. We're in Silicon Valley, we're in San Francisco, and you would think that they would teach more classes about that. We did have one, but it was taught by a student on like, HTML. And it was just like very, very basic stuff. It was like not anything like remotely close to what you would need to know if you wanted to get into like software engineering positions when you grow up, So it's just very ironic.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I spoke at, I think it was like the University of North Carolina or something like that. And like, I gave this like talk and, someone asked like, what languages should we learn if we want to get into software engineering? And I'm like literally talking to like the engineering department. And I was like, definitely don't learn Java, like learn or C, like learn Python or Ruby. Obviously learning something is better than learning nothing, but in terms of getting a job in JavaScript, Ruby, Python, etc., like that's what most things are built in today if you're joining a startup. And like it was kind of like an audible gasp, like what, like we've been learning the wrong thing this whole time, sort of thing. And I'm like, yeah, it's a huge problem. I mean, it's a huge, I think one issue is that if you know those skills, you're not teaching in school, right? You are making $250,000 a year working at Facebook or something like that. Like, I think trying to get those kinds of people into these universities just doesn't really happen. Even in 2020, like in really pretty good schools, like you have to kind of go to, there's very few schools, maybe Stanford or Berkeley or something, that like you can really learn iOS development. Like it's just super hard to learn. And I can't imagine now with what's happening in crypto, like there's probably no school on planet Earth where you can learn, about crypto or Web3 from a university teacher. Like you kind of just have to figure it out yourself, like Googling, 24/7 sort of thing. So it's still very early days. Like that's what it makes me think. It's like, wow, if this is still not easy to get into, like we're still must be so early into kind of software engineering as a discipline.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And you shouldn't be throwing those words around too much. Okay, you get everyone excited around you. W3, where? What 3? I'm just messing around.
Careful with the NFT.
Yeah, I mean, let's quickly dive into being the second employee of Pinterest. Like, what was that experience like? Because we all know Pinterest nowadays as this big company that it's like one of the staples in Silicon Valley, right? Something that we use every day for inspiration. What was building out that framework like, scaling out the team? And after we hear that story, like how did you transition that experience over to Gumroad, right? You want to hear like that link between your experience as the second employee to starting your own thing eventually.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think working at Pinterest was an interesting experience. I think it was probably more unique than I thought at the time, because that was my first foray into like working at a company at all. And so I was like, okay, like this is what all companies must be like. And, at the time Pinterest was, we had an apartment basically in Palo Alto and a roommate even. And there was 4 of us total, 2 founders, employee number 1, Yash, and me. And then Marty joined. So I guess 5, and then soon 6 with Enid. So maybe 6 or so, in a room, with like IKEA desks and like MacBooks or whatever, right? Like that's it. And like it really showed me like, wow, this is what it takes to build a company. Like almost nothing in today's world, like a laptop, an internet connection. I'm sure everyone has an iPhone, some desks, a couple chairs, and that's it. Like, that's like an amazing thing. And, that's how Pinterest, which is, I don't know what it's worth today publicly, but probably like $40 billion or something like that. That's what it took. Just like 6 people in a room with some laptops. And then the day-to-day was actually incredibly like similar to everybody else I've talked to, which is, You show up to work, you ship some code, you fix some bugs, you design some stuff, you have a meeting or two, you talk to some customers, and then you go home, and it's like, I think one thing that I think people may expect working at like a startup like Stripe or Pinterest or something like that is that there's like some magic, like there's some secret sauce. And it's like, no, the secret sauce is a lot of duct tape. Like every startup is on fire. Like it's just crazy. Like, I don't know. I remember reading about Facebook scalability problems and I was like, wow, I don't even comprehend how you scale like a billion user website. Like, how does that, like, where do you even store the data? How do you make it fast? Like, how do you do search? Like, I don't like as a kid, I was like, I don't know how this would even, how you'd build something like this. And then you talk to someone who's done it and you're like, they're just like, they break it down and they're like, oh, you just have like a bunch of databases and you shard them and then you shard them in this way. And then if people ping, people whose names begin with A, you send them to this database. And obviously this whole time, like computers and compute are getting faster and cheaper. So it's getting easier and easier. Like a single person could build $1 billion user instance of some product today, right? Like it's possible now with Amazon, web services and Google Cloud and all these sorts of things, which is just mind-boggling, I think. But yeah, it was honestly like a very boring sort of startup in that way, where like it was just like you come into work with a bunch of smart people, and I probably didn't appreciate at the time like how awesome everybody was. Like I've talked to lots of startups since, and I was like, okay, yeah, Ben is an exceptional person. He is now the CEO of a $40 billion company instead of a CEO of a 6-person company. So like very few people can run a $40 billion company. So I just assumed everyone was like Ben, versus like, okay, maybe Ben is kind of an exceptional founder CEO. But I don't know. Yeah, I think the biggest thing it taught me was like, there are no secrets. There's no magic. There's just a bunch of people working really hard on a problem who are very kind of honest about it. I think that's the thing that a lot of people get stuck on is like, Pinterest pivoted, 3 or 4 times as a company and even as a product. And so I think that takes a level of like discipline in the sense that like you have to confront the fact that you built something that no one wants. And that's hard. I think very few people could do it. And even before Pinterest, I think Bennett had like 1 or 2 different companies, had gone through YC 2 or 3 times, like had been through, like many people, I think at that point would have stopped, right? They would have gotten a job at Google like he had before, or stopped being an entrepreneur in some capacity, but like he was like, still going. And now he's a billionaire, but like, yeah, I remember talking to him one time. One thing that I asked him was like, yeah, what's the difference between people who succeed and people who fail? And he's like, basically, there's only one thing that is consistent, which is the people who fail stopped. Everything else is, debatable, but like definitionally, the only thing that people who failed, like why they failed is because they stopped. Like otherwise, you're not yet failing, right? You're still going. And so that was like pretty profound to me. And I think probably informed the way that I thought about Gumroad when it wasn't doing so well in sort of the middle of the journey. Like I was like, well, the people who succeed are just the ones who don't stop. So I should keep going,
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that like pretty deeply. Like obviously it's not always true. There's certain people who should stop, should give up. Like it is healthy to revisit your prior assumptions. But I think if you have conviction and you really believe in a certain life path for yourself, and I don't think you should settle on that. Like, I think it's worth figuring it out, even though it might take 5 years or 10 years to get to that point,
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that statement too. As long as it's all about, I mean, at that stage, right, it's all about the founders. Like you have to keep pushing forward. If you truly believe in something, you're gonna find something that breaks through, right? And as Steve Jobs famously did with Apple, it's like if you believe in something hard enough, you sort of just bend reality and just bend it and like make things happen, right? But it takes a lot of conviction, a lot of like knowledge and experience, like sort of just grind it through when everyone is against you. And I really like the fact that you brought that every startup is always on fire. I don't think that when we look from an outside in, we look at Pinterest or we look at Facebook or something, we're like, oh wow, like these companies are so well run. Like I want to work there. It seems like it looks like Disneyland. I'm gonna walk inside, right? But in reality, it's a bunch of people that believe in the vision and they make things happen on a daily basis. So
Yeah, I mean,
thanks for highlighting that.
Facebook is Disneyland, but it's also on fire all the time. Like
Every company's on
I mean,
fire.
that's like, I mean, by the way, Disneyland's probably on fire all the time too, right?
Oh yeah, for
You
sure.
probably don't see it, but I
Yeah.
can't imagine like what must go down at, you know, like the amount of kids doing stuff they shouldn't be doing. Like,
yeah.
I actually like reminded me of like, I did see a photo of Disneyland actually. And it was like the sort of, it wasn't like a trash chute, but it was like the hallways that kind of people would go down that to like collect trash and like move stuff around. And, you know, basically like the hallways of Disneyland, like just like an airport, right? You don't see most of the airport because security, right? Like most of that is hidden away from you. And it's like people drive in there and cars go through and all this kind of stuff, right? But I saw that photo and I was like, holy crap, like obviously Disneyland must have this. It's not like trash just magically just disappears, right? They don't shoot it with a gun or something. But it, when you see it, you're like, oh wow, like it's just a bunch of duct tape, you know, again, or like Vegas is like this, right? You can see this where you like drive down the strip of Vegas and you're like, wow, this is crazy, beautiful. You know, maybe I guess people disagree on that, but I think it's beautiful. It's just crazy, right? Crazy stuff happening. And then you drive like on the other side and there's just like a bunch of like warehouses and like trucks pulling in and pulling out, right? And you're like, oh, okay, it's just, you know, it's just a bunch of equipment, you know, and food and people like making this thing happen. But it doesn't happen just organically. It happens because a bunch of humans work together to make it happen. And it's not easy either. It's just like a lot of hard work, you know, to do what everybody does, I think.
So true, so true. Not a lot of people see what's happening behind the scenes. And I also wanted to add, like, I think, you know, what you mentioned, I really, really like your perspective when you mentioned that, like, when you saw Ben could do it with Pinterest, that you thought, like, oh, anyone could do it, you know? I think it's also like a lot of people can't comprehend how people are like running businesses at that magnitude. So they don't think it's possible.
Yeah.
But if you're talking to people every day on like a daily basis and like, you know, hearing what they're saying, like, oh, it's like, it's even if it's complex, it's actually really simple. Like all you need is A, B, and C, and you can do it, right? All you need is like hard work and consistency and just don't stop, right? And I think if you have the opportunity to like talk to them every day and just like hearing them out, seeing what they're doing on a day-to-day basis, like, you know, it is possible. And for you to have that experience, it's like, I think like being so young too, being at Pinterest at such a young age, you were able to have the opportunity, kind of have like an open window to see like what is possible.
Yeah, and they're very like transparent. And you know, one of the reasons I joined is because they're very open to me like sitting in on like pitch meetings with Benchmark and like things like that like a lot of people just don't get to do because they just don't ask. You know, I was very upfront, like, look, this is what I care about. And it turns out everyone is cool. Like if you're showing drive and hustle, like people are pretty willing to, like, it's like, wait, you're gonna do work for me for free, like, or like you're offering to do more, like of course I'm gonna say yes to that. But I think a lot of people, you know, fear that. I would say the other thing, there's this rule in system design called Gall's law. I think it's Gall's law, which basically is like every complex system starts as a simple system and then gets more complex over time. And no complex system was originated as a complex system. Like you can't make up like a really complicated system without basically starting from some small thing and then adding layers and layers and layers onto it, right? And just like the reason Ben can run Pinterest, which is like, I think 3,000 or 4,000 employees now. I was talking to him the other day, actually. I was like, how do you do this? And he's like, it's the same on basically, right? It's like what I was doing before. It's just more people that I don't see or interact with, but like I'm doing the same. And, you know, he didn't go from 0 to 3,000 people, right? He went from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 to literally every single number down the line. And so it's totally possible. Like how can Jack Dorsey run Square and Twitter at the same time? Like how is that physically possible? Well, the truth is he could run 5 more companies at the same time because his time is not the bottleneck, right? And like this stuff gets scaled out. People do the jobs that you used to be doing and you get to kind of operate at a higher level of abstraction, or Elon with Tesla and SpaceX and all the other things he tweet, you know, Twitter, like blah, blah, blah. Like there's enough time in the day. It's, you know, and the human brain is like insane. I mean, it's like it's a crazy invention or discovery or whatever. Right. But it can do so much. Like it's crazy how much it can do. And I think people like just but the way you get there is you have to start small and then like iterate and improve and add complexity over time, just like Gumroad or Pinterest or Facebook. Like all these things started out really small, like tiny MVPs. And then over time you add employees and people and users, and, like just like how you scale Facebook to 1 billion users, no one knew how to do that when Facebook started. Like literally nobody had ever done that in the history of humanity. No one had ever scaled a single service to 1 billion people. And then now there's like 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 different services that have done that, so like you have to have confidence that you'll be able to figure it out as you go. And that's the only way. You cannot like sit, Zuck couldn't have like sat by himself and been like, this is how you scale Facebook to 1 billion users. Like literally the technology to do that didn't exist, but like, it's almost like a level of faith that like, if you believe you can go to Mars, you also have to believe that the technology you need and the costs lowering and the economies of scale and the people will show up as you make progress towards that goal. It's like the bridge will get constructed like as you walk, on the bridge, which I think is scary to a lot of people. Like I think many people want all the answers before they get started. They're like, I need to know how this. I have a friend actually who was like really early at Square, and he like, he's made enough money. He doesn't really have to work a day in his life. But yeah, he's wanted to start companies. And every single time he like pitches me on an idea, I'm like, this is great. Start working on it. And he's like, well, there's this problem here. There's this, that. And it's like, I haven't figured out how we get to this point. And it's like, well, you never will, to be honest. Like if you're waiting for all the answers, like it's like the Minimalist Entrepreneur, the book that I wrote, I didn't have the title until I finished writing the whole book. And then I had to come up with a title that represented what's in the book. Right. But if I sat around and like waited for the title before I wrote the first chapter, before I wrote the second chapter, et cetera, like I would never have gotten to this point, where I have a book. I had no idea how to write a book. I just had faith that I would figure it out along the way and people would help me because, other people have, like it's not like I'm the first ever to write a book. So it must be possible. And, so that happens quite frequently. Like as long as you start and that's the hardest thing to do. Other people are happy to support you because they don't want to start, they don't want to start from scratch. They want to join and help, just like I did at Pinterest. Right. And so as long as you start, there's going to be way more people who are going to be willing to help you get to the next step and the next step and the next step after that. So
I absolutely agree with that statement. Taking action leads to great results. As long as you keep on moving your feet and doing more every day, you're going to continue, you're going to build up the momentum that people want to be a part of. Right. But it's hard to like push the momentum forward and really take action every day. It's like Maggie said earlier, it's about consistency, about taking action, it's about believing in yourself, it's about a lot of things, right? But most importantly, just moving forward is.
Yeah. I have one story real quick that I think is a really good one, like from my Pinterest days. The way the Pinterest P was designed was that we hired a designer, and that person, I believe weed was involved, but basically would draw, I don't know what the number was, but I heard hundreds of Ps. And every single P, the only rule is that each P had to be different than the last P. So you had to come up with like a different design for the P. And that is a really amazing thing that everyone I know does, is like, you just do a lot. Like to make something really good, you kind of just have to do a lot of them. And but it just doesn't get talked about. I think people think that to come up with a Pinterest P, you like sit down and you draw a P and you're like, cool, that's, edit it a little bit here and there. No, you just start from scratch and do it over and over and over again. You force yourself to keep moving, as you mentioned, and eventually you'll get something really, really compelling. But that might be your like 300th P, where you would have given up at 299. It's like, no, you have to keep going and going and going and go until you're bored. I think it's actually incredibly important to get to a point where you are bored of what you're doing, because then you'll force yourself to have like more and more interesting, weird ideas. You're like, this is a stupid P, but I've drawn all the easy ones, so I'm going to do one that looks like that. And then, that's how you break out of your patterns. And I think
bless that person who drew that P. It's a staple P now.
Yeah, now everyone knows that P. It's pretty cool, but that's what it takes,
I love that. Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, that like applies to everything. That's like a really good analogy to.
Remember, guys, go out there and draw your P's until you get it right.
Exactly. Draw your P's. It works. Like you literally, if you do something 300 times, you will do something good. right? Like, what are the statistical odds? Even if you have a 1% chance, it's basically becomes a 99.9% chance if you do something 300 times, right? Like if you do 300 golf strokes, like one of those things will be good, like, and then your mental model, your brain will be able to do it again because it kind of knows what it needed to do. Like that's how muscle memory gets built, right? Like that's literally what muscle memory is you cannot read a book on muscle memory, right? No, you have to like practice the stroke or the swing or the whatever movement. And then eventually, like, how to ride a bike and you have no idea how. Like you cannot tell me how you ride a bike, right? But you know how to do it. You can't teach anyone else. All you can do is encourage them so they don't give up. And I actually think like many things in business and entrepreneurship and software, et cetera, like it's like riding a bike where you just have to do it and you'll figure it out over time. It'll click, like things will start to click for you and you don't have to think about them so much. Just like speaking a language, right? You don't have to think about speaking the language over time you get better and better. Like, I don't know how the English language works. It's freaking weird, but I just speak it and people speak it back to me. And, like, I don't know, but like, sometimes someone will sit down and be like, have you thought about the fact that this weird rule exists in English? And I'm like, that's weird. I don't know how foreign speakers have to figure that out. That's like insane. But I've never, like, for example, you can't say like the red big truck, right? You have to say the big red truck. Why? I don't know. I literally don't know. But you just know that it sounds wrong when you say the red big truck, and so like, you have to say the big red truck. And so the only way to learn those things, like you can't read that in a book. You're never going to be able to memorize it. You just have to do it enough. And then eventually you just stop thinking about it. Your brain just works. I never have to think about, what order are the
you
adjectives.
Just get tougher, you just get a lot tougher and life experience happens and you learn more.
Exactly.
Yeah. I like that English reference though. I think about that all the time. I'm like, if anyone was a foreigner who was like trying to learn the English language, if that was me, I would get so frustrated. Like words like yacht, like why did they spell it like that? It's just like simple things like that.
Yeah, yacht is a very strange thing. Don't stare at any word you stare at too long. You'll start to be like, what is like equity? You're like, what is that? Yeah. It's totally random. The other crazy thing is like, there's no spaces when you speak. Like, there's no spaces when you speak. You just speak in a constant blah, 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 like to anybody else. That's what it sounds like. And so even the spaces that are like in your head, like they're projected in your head. It's like when I say it's just it's a one word. Like I don't say one word. So you just don't think about those things after a point, right? So yeah, same goes for, I think, many, many, many skills that we just don't apply the same mental model to, but would probably apply pretty well.
Yeah, for sure. So Sahil, we'd love to talk about Gumroad. You being at the age of 19, a solo founder and, founding Gumroad in 2011, we obviously know that it grew at such a substantial rate and almost immediately you raised about $10 million. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So talk about just like the inspiration of founding Gumroad and what was that growth like at such a young age?
And the lesson learned too, because, we followed Gumroad for a bit. So we want to hear all about it.
Yeah, totally. So I started Gumroad as a weekend project initially. I wanted to sell this pencil icon that I designed in Photoshop to my audience on Twitter. And I just assumed it was going to be easy. This is a lesson learned for me, is like anytime I think something's going to be easy and then it isn't for whatever reason, great business opportunity there. In the book, I call them toe stubs, where you're like, I should be able to do it. And then you can't. And then most people, most of the time say, oh, no, too bad, or like there's a reason that this thing is hard or broken or annoying or expensive or whatever, right? Like there's a reason that there's no Starbucks like 6 miles away from me or whatever. Like, but often there isn't. Often like just no one has done it yet, or solved the problem yet. So anyway, I wanted to sell this pencil icon, thought I could, realized I couldn't. Like literally was like, I needed to build like a website and embed like a PayPal button onto it. And then I would have to like email everyone who buys the thing and send them like the PDF or in this case, the icon file. It just was like really strange to me. And my epiphany, sort of the reason I thought it was kind of had the potential to be kind of a high growth startup, was basically this realization that, wow, like there must be so many people, right? Musicians, designers, writers, filmmakers, stand-up comedians, photographers, like all sorts of different kinds of creative people who are building audiences online. That's getting easier and easier with Twitter and Facebook and Pinterest and Reddit and YouTube and Instagram, et cetera. And there's all of these people, none of them have websites. Like they just have these audiences. They need to sell stuff directly to them. And so that was kind of the idea behind Gumroad. I started it out as basically a Bitly plus a credit card form, like a very, very simple MVP where you would say, hey, I want to send people to this file. I want to charge $1 or $5 or whatever. And then we would just facilitate the transaction. And then every month I would manually pay everybody out to make sure that, you know, there was no real marketplace. I was just like handling the transactions and then paying everybody else out very, very, very manually. And, you know, once a month. And it would take me like half a day on a Saturday or something like that to do using PayPal. And so, yeah, I had the idea for it. And it honestly, I think reminded me, I think I didn't realize this at the time, but one of the reasons it excited me so much was the App Store was what unlocked this whole career path for me, right? And what the App Store did was it allowed me to focus on making an app instead of payments and legal stuff and operations and finance and all of the non-making the new app, right? I could outsource to Apple. And it costs a lot of money to do that, but Apple would handle it and it was worth it for me. And Gumroad felt similar in that way, where it was a platform. It would help people sell content and then they could just focus on making the content, and Gumroad would kind of automate the sales, operations, finance, legal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you just get like a paycheck at the time in your PayPal account once a month. And so I shipped it, that sort of weekend project, on Monday morning, got a bunch of eyeballs. Like there was a lot of interest in this kind of idea. And part of that interest was a bunch of investors in Silicon Valley. And, you know, part of working at Pinterest at the time and being in the Bay Area was like, I'd started networking with, you know, investors and founders and engineers and designers and all the sorts of people who, you know, kind of are in the startup industry. And so there was the minute it launched, or maybe the hour it launched or something, there's just tons of interest, like tons of people being like, wait, what? Like you built this whole product and you're, you know, is this a company? Like, are you raising money? Like that, those are just the kind of questions that people ask in Silicon Valley. And it was kind of like almost similar to Pinterest, where like Pinterest was like, hey, did you know you can work at a startup? I was like, wait, what? I can do that now? I thought I had to get a degree, you know? And so the same thing happened with Gumroad, where there was enough demand from people who are like, hey, if you like, let me know when you start this as a company or start another company, I'd love to invest. And I got maybe even just one or two or three of those people. And I was like, wait a second. Like when I went to school, like my goal was to graduate, 4 years, get a degree, then work at Google for like a bunch of years, then work at a mid-sized company, work at a startup, and then finally start a company when I was like 35 or whatever. And then all of a sudden, like I went from like being in high school in Singapore to like investors offering me money to start a company in like a year and a half. Like it was mind boggling to me. But yeah, I was like, well, wait a second, I can skip, my whole, like I can basically get to the end of my career today. Like I can skip to at least the dream job that I really wanted, which was I can raise money, start a company, kind of do whatever I want. Obviously like high failure risk, et cetera, but I could try. And the way that I positioned it, you kind of asked before, like, my parents and encouragement, like how they handled like me going to, the States for college and then dropping out to join Pinterest and then dropping, even like that was risky. And then leaving Pinterest to start my own company, and, it was also kind of another level of risky, even though the first risk actually would have worked out quite well. But I always message it to them and myself as like, look, like I'm trying something new. And if this doesn't work, I can go back to what I was doing before, right? I can kind of go up the stack. Like I can join Pinterest. And if Pinterest fails, then I just go back to getting my degree. Like USC's happily going to welcome me back. They want my money, like they're not going to say no to that. And if Gumroad didn't work out, I could go back to work at another startup or even Pinterest or go back to USC even, like there's all of these options that I felt were kind of safety nets in a way. Right. And so I wouldn't totally like just crash land. I would be able to kind of buffer my fall a little bit with these different opportunities. And actually having these opportunities makes you vastly more employable. Right. So like my expected value, expected comp, even if Gumroad had totally failed, would be like 2 to 3x higher, because companies like Pinterest and Twitter and all these companies today are trying to hire people who've founded things, because that's what they really need. Is they need people who built stuff from zero, because they're trying to build stuff from zero within the organizations themselves, and they don't have enough people who've done that before. There's just not enough people who've done that before on an absolute number, right? So at Twitter, there's even less. And so that's kind of how I kind of thought about it. And so I left Pinterest, raised a seed round, raised $1 million, initially $1.1 million in the fall of 2012 or 2011. And then in 2012, early 2012, raised a Series A from Kleiner Perkins. So they put us, it was a $7 million Series A, and then ended up raising a little bit of money since. So kind of ended up being around 10 million or so dollars in that kind of era of the company. And then kind of just, basically spent the money on hiring engineers, shipping product, and just, again, going back to what I was saying at Pinterest, right? Just like the loop, right? Of just like showing up to work, shipping product, talking to customers, trying to improve the product, doing that over and over again. And then luckily the product kind of grew, and we hit sort of what people call product market fit, right? And that's kind of like what happened until 2015, when we went out, tried to raise the Series B, and then failed to do that. So things stopped working out for me, but I was on a nice little run for the first few years of my career, at least.
Yeah, let's talk about, if you don't mind us talking about that a bit more, the fail Series B. We read your blog about it, and you went into really steep details about your statistics and charts and everything. Can you kind of explain to us, like, what was going through your mind from a mental standpoint? From like mentally, what were you thinking about yourself, your employees, your company? And then kind of talk about like what were some of the reasons why you guys were unable to go for a Series B?
Yeah, totally. It was tough, honestly. We went out initially, we had like maybe a year and a half worth of runway. We would have run out in sort of like mid 2015 or so. And so I started talking to investor friends of mine in sort of fall or winter of 2014. And they came back and said, you have a great team, you have a great product, you have product market fit, it seems, because you're even growing up and to the right, but you're not going to be able to raise a Series B, or at least you're going to have a hard time. And the reason, I kind of have a singular reason in I'm sure other people have other opinions on it, but my sort of view on it is that the numbers just weren't strong enough. Like, we were growing up and to the right, but what I didn't really estimate at the time was how important sort of this compounding month over month growth was. You can't just be growing up and to the right. You have to be growing at a rate that shows your potential to be 100x or 1000x investment over time, which means you have to be growing 20, 30% a month at that scale that we were at. Like, you have to be growing very, very fast. And we just weren't. Right. And so that was rough, honestly, because I had publicly put so much into, Gumroad as my identity. I was like, as I mentioned, I was like, my bio is like founder of Gumroad, right? Like, literally that's it, which is great if it's working, and maybe not so great when it stops working so well. But yeah, that was the hardest thing. The hardest thing was realizing, wow, I put all of my eggs into one basket. Even though everyone tells you startups are really high risk, I think if you're a founder, you kind of believe that you're going to defy the odds. And then when you realize, like, oh, maybe you are part of that statistics, right? That's like pretty brutal to your kind of ego. And the way that I dealt with it was basically saying, look, I'm not going to fail. I know Gumroad will exist because I have positive unit economics. And if I really need to, I can run the team or run the company very, very lean, right? Very small. And obviously it wouldn't be easy. We'd have to do a round of layoffs. We'd have to let a bunch of people go. We'd have to get rid of the San Francisco office. I might have to leave San Francisco. There are a bunch of things that may need to happen, but Gumroad's not going to die. And I think as long, it's kind of like when it almost gets harder sometimes when you realize that, because it's kind of like, you can finish the marathon, but you still have 10 miles to go. You're like, oh, I know I can finish. So like, it's up to me. And that sucks, because I wish I almost got hurt and then I didn't have to. But if I know I can, then it's only me stopping me, right? And so that's kind of what I realized in sort of that 2015 timeframe. And I told the whole team, this is something I'm very glad that I did, but I told the entire team, We were around 20, 23 people at the time. And I said, look, it was January and it was our all hands. And I was like, we in our current state will fail to raise our Series B. Like, I just think it's incredibly unlikely with the numbers. The good news is the only thing we have to fix is the numbers. If we can fix the numbers, we have the right team, we have everything else. We just need to fix the numbers and maybe I thought we focused a little bit too much on other things. We thought investors would give us a little bit more leeway. Turns out they really need the numbers. So like, let's just focus on the numbers. Let's show them that we can move the numbers. We called it moving the needle, but effectively inflect the numbers. And then I'm going to keep talking to investors and I have good relationships with them. So they'll be honest with me. And as soon as we believe we have the numbers, we'll go raise the money and we'll get back to it. And then 9 months later, we didn't have the numbers. It turned out it's much harder to like fix those kinds of things than we initially thought. We did have a great team. We did ship a ton of features, but it just, the macro kind of environment, I think, was just too strong. And I talk about this in the essay where I say, basically the market you're in is going to determine most of your growth, right? Like you cannot be in control of how, for example, COVID was amazing for Gumroad. We doubled. We went from 5 million to 10 million in revenue, which is just crazy for basically no employee company with no marketing, no sales team, nothing, like just pure organic growth. Why? Because COVID like wasn't up to us, right? So it cuts both ways. It can be really great, it can be really terrible, but I think it's important to understand that you can't surf in a lake. You have to go find an ocean. And I think Gumroad was kind of a lake in that way. And so I told the team, hey, we didn't hit the numbers. We're going to have to do a round of layoffs. Shouldn't be surprised to anybody because we've been talking about this for the last 9 months. And it wasn't. And everyone was very grateful, or maybe not grateful is the right word, but like, understanding, I guess. Right. And actually even some employees are like, wow, you must have had such a hard time. And I'm like, what? I'm like one who's letting you go. Like I'm still, but they're just, I think like that's been a theme that I try to kind of honor all the time, which is like, I try to be super transparent with everybody. I find that is like a great way to build trust with people. And when things work, or even when they don't work, like that's how you retain that trust and integrity is you never surprise anybody. I found that works pretty well, but yeah, that's kind of what happened. And then, basically Gumroad shrunk. It ended up being like a small team of like 5 people. And then eventually it was just me at the time. And I just ran the ship basically by myself for like a couple of years. And then Gumroad has sort of been on the uptick recently. So we've kind of grown and now we're doing great, but it was definitely like a rough period of time. And the way that I justified it to myself was a lot of it is a matter of perspective, right? Like the easy kind of Silicon Valley framing of it, which was the framing that I was coming from, was I tried and failed very publicly to build a $1 billion company, and I don't have a team, and Gumroad's probably not going to be a unicorn, and no one really cares about me. And so that kind of sucks. And I have to like do support and like keep the lights on, but I don't have any energy to do anything else or whatever. That's one framing. The other framing, or another framing, is I can travel the world. I can work on this thing a few hours a week, do support, keep the lights on, and then I can write or paint or draw or do nothing. I have almost unlimited time, right? And I just slowly try to adopt the second way of thinking. And it was like, I think that is really what gave me the energy to be grateful for my sort of situation instead of bitter about it, And once I was grateful for it, then I was like, wow, this is amazing. I can do whatever I want. Over time, that allowed me to build up my own energy kind of reserves and then hire people. And then now I still run Gumroad today. We're at like 12 million ARR and growing pretty nicely. And we have all this amazing stuff that we get to do, but only because I was not going to fail, right? Like it was just not an option for me. And maybe that's survivorship bias, because maybe Gumroad could have still failed. Who knows? There are certainly those moments, but all I can say is that it worked, for me eventually. But yeah, like COVID is, like a great example. Like I could not have predicted COVID, right? Nobody could have predicted COVID really, but but the only way Gumroad would have been able to take advantage of COVID was if we just stuck with it for literally 9 years, and then we had an amazing year, and now Gumroad's onto the races. But many people I think would have given up at year 7 or year 8 or year 8.9. And how crappy would that have been, right? How crappy would that have been if I stopped working on Gumroad? Either I sold the business or shut it down or whatever I ended up doing with it. And then COVID happened, and I'd be like, dang it, if I only waited another 6 months, or a year or whatever. But, ultimately I stuck with it, and, I was eventually kind of rewarded for that. So that's the only kind of advice that I can give, is like, it worked for me. Right. So don't give up. If you really do have conviction in your idea, like I did, I felt like the creator economy was eventually going to happen. I was just early. Then, you end up getting rewarded for it, I think.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to share with us that story. Wow, it was a lot to take in for us, even as podcast hosts, and just understanding, because for us it's like we kind of feel like the up and downs, like the sense of like the struggle, the loneliness. And we're just looking at you from a different lens now. It's remarkable because you're so resilient and gritty, and you never gave up. Although COVID is a really bad thing that happened to the earth, like it did many ways benefit your business a lot. So we're really happy for that. And man, like I gotta re-listen to this part again after we were done recording here, so I can digest that part again, because I think you just gave us a whole life experience in like a 15-minute segment. It's like 7 years
Definitely,
and 15 minutes.
definitely. Yeah. Like I feel like I feel like I had a career within, 3 or 4, which is, what entrepreneurship kind of is, to be honest. It's like a career squeezed into a few year period, and you
age a lot up here, but you're physically still the same.
Yeah, at least it's not. It was kind of like, if you look at the the photos of like Obama, like before
his
he
hair
was
got
president.
so gray. I saw that.
Like,
Yeah.
it's like that much. I'm sure being president is much harder, but like, wow, like there's certain experiences where you just experience a lot.
Yeah, you're gray in your mind, but you're physically young.
That's the other thing that I love about being an entrepreneur is, you have to. You can't say no sometimes, and that is sometimes like what you need. It's like a coach that says, sorry, you're staying in the game even though you want to throw up, and afterwards you're like grateful for the coach. In the moment you're like, this sucks.
Yeah.
Right. And I think entrepreneurship and starting a business is kind of like that, because look, if I stopped, Gumroad just stops. Like,
Right.
so that that is definitely part of the pros and cons of entrepreneurship is it's all your fault in a way, but also sometimes is the best learning you'll ever have is when you're the only one who can. You have to figure it out.
Yeah, so we got a glimpse of like your book, The Minimalistic Entrepreneur, and now I can kind of see how everything links together. But let's dive deep into that a little bit more. Like, tell us about, like, you mentioned now you have more time to write, to paint, to travel. Let's talk about the book real quick.
Yes, totally. So you mentioned kind of like the oxymoronic nature of the title, right? It's minimalist, which is about kind of lack of ownership, maybe lack of time spent doing things you don't want to do, and then entrepreneurship, which is often linked to owning things. First and foremost, owning a business, but also having everybody kind of come to you, and like not being very free, kind of being on call all the time, working 60 hours a week or whatever it may be. And I had a joke the other day. It said, like, entrepreneurship is working 60 hours a week to avoid working 40 hours a week. It's like, it's more work, but it's a better kind of work, hopefully. And yeah, I think the kind of book just explores this idea of how can you own a business without the business owning you, right? How can you start a business, scale the business, grow the team, build a product, solve customers' problems and needs, but in a way that lets you travel, draw, write, paint, do all of the things that you may want to do. And ideally, like the vision I have for the world is, if we have a bunch of minimalist entrepreneurs, we have a bunch of people who are building wealth, but also not being slaves to their job, right? Not being totally corporatized in the process. And I think it's important. Like, I just think it's really important that we make entrepreneurship more accessible to more people, because I think the vast majority of people, when they think about entrepreneur, they don't identify with it. Even I didn't consider myself an entrepreneur in high school or college, even though I ended up becoming one. And I actually wanted to like go right into entrepreneur as a title, because I wanted to see if we can redefine the word a little bit in people's heads, because I think it's important. I think business ownership, being a creator, building an audience, creating a product, selling that product, like those are amazing things that we need more of in the world if we want all these problems that we have to get solved. Like the way climate change gets solved is not a bunch of people tweeting or writing. It's a bunch of people building businesses, and not one business that solves it all, but many, many, many thousands of businesses that all do a little bit. That's at least my belief.
And the way, obviously that's not the case right now. I see a lot of tweets out there. I'm just messing
I do
around.
tweet a lot. You can do both. You can do both. But you know, and tweeting is good, it has some benefits, but ultimately, yeah, you need the entrepreneurship component as well. It's not a replacement for it, right? And I think the way you make it accessible to everybody is kind of like what Marie Kondo did, right? You just find an approachable, very kind of like well-meaning, simple message that helps people think through what does building a business actually mean. Like if people do have an image of Facebook and supercomputers and sharding and all these crazy terms that scare people away, how do we make it as approachable, as accessible, as minimal as possible, which is literally, you know, as I mentioned, kind of like a bunch of IKEA desks and laptops and, you know, an internet connection. That's what you need. Everything else is optional. And so I think it's just, that's a lot of kind of why I titled the book the way that I did. And part of the message I hope kind of comes across over time is that like entrepreneurship doesn't have to be a scary big thing. Running a business is not some weird, daunting corporate task in which you need like a suit and a briefcase and whatever else like you think of when you think of entrepreneur. It's just a person who solves a problem for a group of people, charges money for it, it pays the bills, they, you know, maybe pays payroll, other people's bills too, and that's a business, you know. And then beyond that, you can kind of do more and more with it, but at least you have the building blocks to kind of get financial freedom and financial independence, and then you can kind of start solving other problems that you may want to with your time and money and energy, effort, attention, etc.
Absolutely. I love that you kind of break it down for us, because I think a lot of people oftentimes say entrepreneurship is very daunting and it's hard, which it is, you know, it can get very complex, but you know, you mentioned time and time again that it can also be very simple, you know, and there's a problem and you're trying to solve that problem, and, you know, you get paid for it, and it's really just that simple.
Yeah. Yeah. And like, again, like things get complicated over time, but they start simple, right? Always. Right. And over time, as things do get more complicated, turns out there are professionals, there are experts, and they don't want to start companies. And so if you can say, hey, I built this thing, it has product market fit, I need help, I guarantee you there'll be a line of people who are like, awesome. Do you need a CFO? Do you need a support person? Do you need a designer? Like that, you know, tons and tons of that. Right. And so we have this like pretty big supply demand issue where there's like a lot of people who want to work at companies, not that many people who want to start them. And I think the solution is to get more and more people excited about starting as many businesses as possible, and many per person too. Right. It's not, I think one idea that I try to hit on in the book is that success is about you as a person, not about your business. Ultimately, like your business, many businesses you start will not work out, but that's fine, because the goal is not to have a successful business. The goal is to be a successful entrepreneur. And that might mean, yes, at some point you need a successful business, but often the path to a successful business is actually through 3 failed businesses, right? Just like Pinterest, I think is a great example of this, right? You know, or Elon with Tesla, like it wasn't his first thing, you know. It takes time to get to the bigger and bigger ideas, and you build confidence in yourself and your ability to do that. And that's really the only way. But at the beginning, like start the lemonade stand. Like don't start the 3 Michelin starred restaurant, right? Start the lemonade stand, then do the pop-up dinner, then do like the pop-up dinner instead of at your house, maybe at like some restaurant down the street, and, you know, and like do that and build up to it. And eventually you'll have a restaurant. You will, or maybe there's a food truck in the middle, right? But you will have a restaurant. Like that is what it takes. And that's what you want it to take, because that's how you'll learn the skills you need to learn. And then when you're ready to own a restaurant, like you'll be an amazing chef or whatever it may be. You don't want to make those mistakes when you have a restaurant. You want to make them when you're doing pop-up dinners for your friends, you know? Same thing goes with tech. Like start with side projects, start with a blog, start with tweeting, start with being a creator. And then over time you can say, okay, I want to build like a moonshot, pie in the sky, you know, big business idea. So yeah, that's at least how I kind of think about it, and how I wish more people thought about it. But many people they don't see that as an option. They just see Facebook and Microsoft. It's like, for example, I had this idea, this is a few years ago. I was like, what if I wanted to start a bank? Well, that seems impossible to me, because there's like Wells Fargo, which is like a 150-year-old company. Like all these, you know, JP Morgan is like a 150-year-old company. Like all I could see are skyscrapers, right? In my head. It's like, how would I start a bank? Like how does that even, and it turns out you can start small and scale up just like they did. They started with one branch, literally. Starbucks was one coffee shop, right? They didn't have some grand vision to like become the dominant whatever coffee purveyor of the world. But I think people don't have enough of those mental images in their head of like, well, what does Starbucks look like when it has one coffee shop? Well, it looks like the thing down the street from you. That's what Starbucks was at one point. And then they just didn't stop, They opened 1 and 2 and 3 and 10 and 50 and 100. And now I don't even know how many thousands of stores they probably have.
Too many.
Too many. I know. Yeah, they have like 3 in my block. And I'm like, what? How's this? But it worked. I get, again, they would only know that they needed 3 when they had 1, and that still didn't have enough demand, or it fill the demand. Then they had 2. That still wasn't enough. Then they added 3, but like, again, even Starbucks still probably doesn't have some grand master plan. They're probably iterating from where they are today and solving problems going forward, right? Instead of looking kind of trying to predict the future and looking backward from there.
I definitely agree. Everything starts with baby steps. And if you break down a problem enough steps, now you have 1 step. Right.
Exactly.
So
exactly.
You have to think about that point of view, that it all 100%. Over time just scales up, compounds, and it just goes astronomically higher than you ever imagined. But since we're a little bit short on time, I want to give our listeners a chance to find out where they can buy the book, or reach out to you, or learn more about you, or read more about your blog, because everything you put out there it's great content. So our listeners, check out his content. It's awesome. I spent a lot of time reading on it too, and it's just great seeing you here in person in our podcast. But yeah, where can our listeners find out more about you?
Yeah, so
Gumroad as well. Gumroad and your book as well.
Yes, totally. So the place to start is probably my Twitter account. At SHL is my Twitter, and that links to Gumroad, where you can learn more about Gumroad, gumroad.com. And also my pinned tweet is that blog post that you mentioned, reflecting on my failure to build $1 billion company. And the book, if you're interested in it, you can check it out at minimalistentrepreneur.com, which has all the links. You can also find it on Audible, Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, Books A Million, and maybe your local bookstore too.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being on our podcast today, Sahil. I feel like this conversation was so insightful, and I feel like our listeners can learn a lot just from this conversation. So thank you so much for being on.
Thank you. That was really fun. Thanks so much for having me again.
No problem. Thank you so much again.